The fact that varieties of English are different from each other in many respects makes codification of these varieties a real challenge. Outer circle Englishes have developed and exist in a multicultural and multilingual context. Unlike the inner circle Englishes, which exist more often than not in monocultural and monolingual context, the Englishes in the outer circle countries, they exist in a context which is not only multilingual but also multicultural. If we take the example of our own country, Pakistan, English is used here along with many regional languages. And these languages are not only 4 or 5 major languages, there are other smaller languages also which exist in our context. And then different regions have their own culture. So in Pakistan, English exists in a context which is multicultural and multilingual, and this context is very different from the context in which English is used in the inner circle countries. Similar contexts exist in other outer circle countries, for example, India, where the context is even more diverse. And this diversification can be seen in many African countries as well, where English is used as an official language. So, when it comes to selecting a variety which is appropriate for this context, it becomes a little challenging because the context of use is very different from the context of use of the varieties from which people want to select one for their own country. Normally, what governments and officials do is that they maintain one of these inner circle varieties, mostly British or American English, as the standard. Although the context of use, as we have just said, is very different, the context of use of these varieties in the inner circle and their context of use in the outer circle is very different. Therefore, selecting one of these varieties as the standard does not really fulfill the need or does not fulfill the purpose of their use. So this attitude is considered inappropriate because it does not address the needs that these people have for the use of English because of their own unique context. And because of this diversity of culture and language, codification is very challenging. Scholars and researchers have identified 5 different challenges that codification faces in the codification of outer circle varieties. The first one is taking a decision between prescription and description. Prescriptivism is the belief that one variety of English is the best, is supreme, and it is superior to all the other varieties, and therefore that particular variety should be selected as the standard and should be promoted. And often it is either the British variety or the American variety. Whereas descriptivism is non-judgmental. It does not, when you describe a language, you do not really discuss how good or bad the language is. You are more factual and more objective. And in this approach, you only focus on how the language is actually used. So you describe the language as it is used without evaluating the language or without being judgmental about the language, without saying whether the language is good or bad or how good or bad the language is. So when it comes to codification, people face this challenge whether they should subscribe to a norm which is established and prestigious, or whether they should overlook the norm and look at how language is being used in their own context. So, codification in the outer circle involves taking 2 kinds of decision. Selecting models for pedagogical use and for prescribing rules, etc. So selecting a model means whether selecting an inner circle model or an outer circle model, a regional model, or a model from an already standardized variety, that is British or American. But then they also have to focus on their own cultural and social needs. And these established norms, these prescribed varieties, may not fulfill their cultural needs. Therefore, codification is challenging in these countries, and the policymakers and the linguists have to take these two kinds of decisions: whether to prescribe to a already established standard, or describe the use of the language in their own context and then codify the language accordingly. The second challenge that is faced for the people when it comes to codifying outer circle varieties is the selection. This outer circle English users communicate within their region, they communicate with each other, and they also communicate with people who use English as native speakers. So they may use English in a context where there is no native speaker present at all. In fact, some people in outer circle countries may never need to speak to a native speaker and may always speak English with each other. And in some cases, some people, they have to communicate with the native speakers as well. So the question arises whether they should select an internal model, a regional model, or they should select an external model, which means one of these standardized inner circle varieties. Selection of an external model is very economical. They do not have to do anything. They do not have to write grammars. They do not have to publish new textbooks. They do not have to write new dictionaries, because all these are already available. But if they select an internal model, of course, then they have to bring out grammar books. They have to bring out dictionaries, and bringing out textbooks and grammar textbooks and dictionaries especially takes a lot of time, effort, and resources. So selecting an internal model is expensive, and selecting an external model is economical. So they are faced with this question whether to select an internal model or an external model. Then there is this question of functions. What functions should be given to the language which is being codified, etc. In functions, we make this distinction of participatory functions, codification for the purpose of mutual collaboration, for communicating with each other, etc. And then separatist function, where you use a particular language or variety for highlighting the distinctions, let's say, between different communities, so that you're able to assert your identity. So in some cases, the function is participatory, where you use a particular variety or language to show collaboration among the people who use this particular language or variety. And sometimes the function is separatist, where the boundaries are drawn between different varieties and languages to highlight the differences. Then there's this question of selecting contents of standards. For example, which variety will determine the content which will be used for that standard. So there are again two possibilities. One is to stay with the British or American model, which is easy and economical, and the other is to select an internal model, which involves again a large amount of work, because it will need again developing lots of resources for the people to prescribe to when it comes to determining the rules for usage and rules for grammar, etc. The advantage of an internal model is that it will give people an opportunity to assert their own identity and claim with pride, maybe, that they have their own English and they do not prescribe to any other English. It will also give more opportunities for creativity. For example, if creativity is imperative because of the new cultural and linguistic context, that creativity will not be looked down upon, will not be questioned, will not be frowned upon, and will be readily acceptable, because those who use this English will be aware of that cultural context which has made that creativity essential. And not only the creation or the publishing of creativity, etc., that creativity will also be accepted. People will readily accept it because of being aware of the cultural context. And then finally, acceptance is a challenge. Like I just said, that when there is creativity and innovation in the language, that creativity and innovation has to be accepted and not looked down upon. And this acceptance is not that easy. Locally defined standards, the standards which are not prescribed by the English of the inner circle, these standards have to be approved and accepted by several bodies. One is the experts and professionals, for example, linguists and other experts, scholars in this field, who have it as their job to design, develop, write dictionaries, grammar textbooks, etc. These innovations have to be accepted by this body of experts and professionals. And then general population. Sometimes in the outer circle countries, our local variety is not accepted even by the local people, and they also prefer an inner circle variety. So this new variety, or the standardization, codification, has to be accepted by general population as well. And then different institutions which will be using this variety. For example, domains of use, government, law, education, all these institutions also have to recognize and approve this particular variety, which is being codified and standardized.